Well, hi, this is Jason T. Ingram, and I'm coming to you from my travel trailer. It's a little too windy outside and didn't have access to the rest of it. And I wanted to add some things to the endless ranting that I did from all these other parts of my video, and my camera kept dying and stuff like that. And I realized that really what I'm saying is geared towards folks who are really questioning their faith, questioning whether they actually want to continue identifying as a Christian or any form of their faith, or maybe changing it. And I was trying to think of ways that if I were to become a Christian again, and I do question that sometimes. It's been over 5.5 years that I stopped identifying as a Christian. I stopped believing the Bible. And I like to keep an open mind that if I were to continue believing and acting and living the same way I am right now, and I died, and the way I'm living is going against this biblical ideology, that I could suffer this horrible eternal punishment. And I like to keep that open mind because there's no way to prove that that can't happen. And it's the same way that I wish that Christians were open-minded, that in the same way we can't prove something that we believe that's invisible like this. And we need to be open-minded that this very well could be not only the invention of people and a lot of psychology that makes a lot of spiritual experiences and a lot of things that are very convincing, that we have a tendency to think that if something is big and powerful and more powerful than us and unexplainable, that it must be God. And if we're scared to challenge it, then that's probably the very thing that you need to challenge. And so I wish more atheists would keep an open mind that they might be wrong and that there could be some type of deity out there, and that deity actually might have a rule book, and it could be something that everybody on earth and in the universe or the multiverse has to follow as closely as we can, or be willing to, or whatever it is. But the thing about being an intellectual, even though I've adopted a lot of atheist views and stuff, is that I can't call myself open-minded if I'm closed off to the Bible. And I decided that over the last year or two that I was going to reincorporate things. And after my house fire, I selected some of my Bibles from my collection, and they were full of notes and underlines and stuff like that, like every good Bible believer would be inclined to do. And I found that it's very empowering to speak some of those things over myself and take them as my own. And I found that very refreshing. I also found it really encouraging to listen to Christian music and even go to church services and worship. And it's so weird to worship as like, I don't identify as a Christian anymore. I don't really pray to the God of the Bible. I don't believe that Jesus is God. I don't believe in the virgin birth. And I don't believe in most of the fundamentals of the Bible. And at the same time, I can appreciate these people. I love these people. I mean, they do so much for the world. They do so much good. And they really have done a lot of good in my life as much as they've done a lot of harm. And I can appreciate that part of my life. I can honor that part of my past without condemning them and arguing with them. And, I could also share some of my stories about some of the abuse. And unfortunately, though, although folks are really sincere and they say, wow, I'm really sorry that happened, that's horrible, typically the response is, yeah, but that was that other church that did that. Our church wouldn't do that. And the thing is that every time I tell a church leader or somebody in a church community that has a definite traditional view of the Bible, like they have on Trinity Broadcasting, and the fundamentalists, for lack of a better term, the fundy culture, that believes that being LGBTQ is a choice. And just that belief is either going to make it so, okay, well, you're doomed to hell, or you're going to have to change. And if you're going to have to change, that's probably, from their perspective, the more compassionate view, although it does definite psychological harm, and I talk about that in this series. But here's the thing, is that if they believe that gays need to change into straights, whether they practice conversion therapy or not, just telling somebody who's a sexual minority is harmful. And when I talk to people about my conversion therapy experience, the religious abuse, folks that were doing the work of a mental health worker, which they weren't qualified to do, and if they were doing things that are against clinical psychology, going against what healthcare is doing. And it's not to say that healthcare is perfect, and science is an ever-evolving science, and it's imperfect. But I found it more reliable than faith. And I found that although the church saved me the first time, gave me a second childhood, protected me from a lot of harm, gave me a lot of structure, gave me a family and a community that I wouldn't have probably had anywhere else, they also gave me a reason to live and a reason to die. And I think that the nail in the coffin was definitely going through these harmful things and surviving them amazingly without a lot of self-harm. And obviously I haven't killed myself. So I really find it amazing that for some reason I'm able to hang out with people of faith, talk about what we have in common, and without arguing with them and without really blaming and accusing them of anything. And the fact that even lately I just feel like, I tried to make some friends, which I give them a chance. And that's just part of me incorporating my faith into my life as being a part of my past and a part of my life. My past is a part of my life. And I think if somebody felt like they had a choice whether to be a Christian or not a Christian, or whether they could choose what kind of Christianity they wanted, whether it was a hyper version or a watered down version or whatever it is, it should be a healthy environment. It should cause somebody to have real joy, not forcing to change to be somebody else. It should give them the freedom that they promise. If they say freedom, 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 and if you feel like you don't have a choice to follow your dream or to love who you should love, to do what you should do in your life, then you're not free. And that's a good way to challenge your faith, and it takes a lot of boldness in order to do that. And not so much for me, because I did it so gradually. I think that was fortunate for me as well. But I think there's some people who just are so ingrained in a faith-based community to where if they continue living that life in that world, they're going to end up in self-harm, or they're going to end up in these extremes where they don't have an internal moral compass to know right from wrong, because they've had a moral compass that was imposed to them on views of the Bible and a bunch of rules that might not even be written, that were just maybe not even spoken. You just get subtle pressure whether to do this or to not do this. And you do it because you want to fit in, not necessarily because it's harmful. And that's a hard thing, because if you've had that for years or decades, and that's your reality, to get out of that is really hard. And it takes a long time, but sometimes you have to make that step to where, well, I'm going to either leave this or suspend it for a while, or step away from it for a while and look at it objectively and say, if I have a choice whether to live this faith or not, what kind of choices would I make? What kind of harm does it do? And does the good outweigh the harm overwhelmingly? And is there any way to find a faith practice or community that has little to no harm in it at all? And I would imagine there's some stuff out there like that. It's just you have the human element, And you have people in power that are seeking places of power. They get addicted to power. And they abuse power. And that's pretty much going to be everywhere when you have positions of power, because people are vulnerable when they get in those places to abuse it. And a lot of people get hurt. And it's very difficult because we need good, solid leadership if we're going to have a faith community and we're going to have structure. So it's a huge puzzle of there's so many good things that religious organizations can do. They serve the community. And here's another thing too, and I don't always like this, but they have an explanation for everything. And whether they're good explanations or not. And the more explanations they have, they're typically trying to justify something that is really squirrely. I think a great example I have is the flat earth people. When they say the earth is flat, they open this huge Pandora's box of, we have to pretty much explain all of these myriad of things that wouldn't make any sense if you believe if the earth is flat. Now, most Christians don't believe that today, but we did a long time ago. And what happens is that when people have this rule book, whether they say they do or not, is a list of things that are harmful and not harmful, and the things that aren't harmful and the things that don't make sense about God is love, and that he's also quite an asshole if you read the Bible. Pardon my French. And they have to explain away all this stuff. And they have to say, well, God is just, and well, he loves us, he'll fight for us, but don't cross him or you're toast. But then again, it's all grace and it's all love, and you have to explain free grace in a way to get people to follow all these rules. And that takes a lot of explanation. And that is very confusing for a lot of people. Now, here's something else too, is that for people that live with cognitive disorders like I do, especially mood disorders, personality disorders, and stuff like that, we like consistency. We like to see people that do what they say they're going to do. And I was raised in a community that put politeness over honesty. And that's what happens when you get around a lot of West Coast urban progressives, is that we try to be polite as we can and make people happy when they're in our presence. And even people that aren't around, we have to talk politically correct so we won't offend people that aren't even in the room. I mean, it is really extreme. And of course, the hypocrisy is just as weird as a lot of the church communities are. But what was hard for me growing up in that world and trying to be reintroduced into that world of progressive, educated people who have a lot of good social skills. They know how to talk really well, and they're really afraid of offending people, which is sort of your quintessential, stereotypical, bleeding heart liberal. But for some people, though, that live with mental disorders, especially on disability, on the lower functioning folks, there's a lot of dissonance there. It's really hard for when people say something is one way and go off and do another. Or they say they're really interested in whatever it is you're doing, and then they disappear. And you find out they really had no interest. They were just saying at the time what they think you wanted to hear. Now, there are church people that do that. It's just that I found them to be a little more honest and upfront, because when you're in a community that talks a lot about honesty and doing what you say, whether they do it or not, they still have that mentality. And they really try to work on honesty, humility, honor, and respect. And that's what I love about the Christian faith, is that I heard a lot of that, and people really tried to practice it. They failed at it miserably, and I did too. It's just that we talked about it a lot, we tried to demonstrate it, and we really worked hard at trying to find out what was helping us to become more honorable, to be better examples, and to be honest. And that was stuff that wasn't emphasized in my community growing up. It was pretty obvious that we all tried to do that. It's just that we've just put this trying to be polite and trying to be affirming and tolerant of all these people and all this kind of stuff like that, and it got out of balance as well. So here's what's tough for me is that if I had a clean slate and I was going to choose a religion that was really honest about itself. And here's the tough thing is that when I get around most born again Bible believers, especially the sort of the postmodern, the sort of megachurch mentality, it's a relationship, not a religion mentality, a lot of the new things that people are saying these days in churches, the purpose-driven life kind of stuff, and is you hear them saying a lot of good things. And one of the things they say, and I heard this even recently too, by somebody who was quite religious, quite conservative, and very exclusive in who they allow into their life and their work. It's about a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's not about a religion. They go, oh, I hate religion. Religion is this, religion is that. And we're not a religion. And then you kind of wonder, well, what's the definition of a religion? And then I get around some of these Western Buddhist type folks, and I was in a congregation there for quite a while. And they started saying the same thing. Oh, we're not a religion here. And then you find out that they definitely have a social pressure to do and to not do certain things. And it is like the epitome of left-wing urban progressive culture. And it was kind of triggering because, you know, growing up in that world and just not knowing if someone says something or they're going to do something, you just never know if they're going to actually do it. And then I started doubting people so much, and then I just couldn't rely on anybody, and just the flakiness was just unbelievable. So here's the funny thing about the whole anti-religion thing and about this trend that people say, I'm spiritual, not religious. And I'm like, fuck that. Because when people say they're spiritual, and then you get to find out most people that say they're spiritual, you'll find out after a while that what they're talking about is what I would define as a religion. And a religion is having a belief system that's based on someone's tradition and practicing it the best you can, I guess. Or a lot of times religion is simply somebody identifying as a certain faith, whether they practice it or not. But a religious institution, though, that claims that they're not a religion, or we're non-denominational, or whatever it is that they say about themselves. Because again, there's what the church actually is, and then there's what people say about the church. And I've been in a lot of churches where they'll even tell you, or organizations, especially the recovery program I was in, so if people ever ask about what you're doing and where you're at, this is what you tell people. And I've seen this about other organizations too, is that you ask them any question about what they do and what they believe and what they're about and stuff, you notice that they all have the same spiel, which is kind of creepy. And a lot of times the spiel that you get is something that everybody says, and a lot of times they say, oh, we're a non-denominational church, we're not a religion, we're a spiritual community, the blah, 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 blah. And you'd be like, yeah. And then you ask somebody else, well, hey, what time is your service and what do you guys do and stuff? And they'll tell you the same thing, and it's kind of creepy because that's like a very cultish type response. When they give an autonomic response about any question that you ask, that gets creepy. But here's the funny part, is that if I were to choose a religion based on the fact that they call themselves a religion, I'd be a Catholic. Because for them, religion isn't necessarily a bad word. It's kind of a good word to them too. But you talk about rules and regulations, and you talk about the cliche of, you know, what I've seen in Catholicism, as much as I like it and as much as I'm drawn to, I call myself somebody that has Catholic affections, you know, loving Catholic music and architecture and all that kind of stuff. And I can't imagine ever being a Catholic and wanting to go to catechism and wondering if they have gluten-free communion wafers or something like that. But here's the thing that's really difficult about finding a particular faith, especially for the mentally ill. And when you are in a time of crisis. When you go, I've been in crisis situations, and I've been in a church because I didn't have anywhere else to go, and that's sad. But unfortunately, most of the time, every time, in my experience, is that I feel like my emotional crisis is taken advantage of, that my real needs aren't met, that's a time when they can influence me, because I am vulnerable to influence when I'm going through a mental health crisis. And if anybody is taking advantage of people in a mental health crisis to influence them, whether they influence them in a way that's healthy or not, they're still influencing them, when what they need is to find out what their needs are, and they'll either meet those needs, or they'll find somebody else or another place that'll meet them. It's that simple, but that just doesn't happen. In reality, it probably does. And I think that that's what a church organization should be, is when you go there, they should find out what your needs are and see if they can meet them or not. It's very simple. You go to a restaurant, this is what you order. You don't go to McDonald's, order a Big Mac, and they say, no, I believe you need fries. You need fries right now, and you need to come back and keep getting more and more and more French fries, more and more French fries. He's like, no, I'm hungry. I want a burger. That's what I'm hungry for. And that would sound crazy, but that's how churches are. I go to a church, and I'll go to a group for depression. They say, no, you need to go to this group because we think you're this. We think you're this kind of addict or that kind of addict. It's like, what? And then when you deny it, well, you're in denial. They've made up their mind what they think your problem and what they think your needs are. And that is a very toxic environment, because you get people who are really addicted to power. And a lot of these reformed addicts can be really addicted to power because of their insecurities and stuff like that, of having that kind of background and never really going to the root of their problem. Some of them do, some of them don't. However, it's really sad how a lot of recovery groups are so demanding and trying to get a hold of people's will, because substance abuse is basically losing your will to a substance. But unfortunately, people, they get off of that substance and they lose their will to the program. And they do the exact same. They become enslaved, where they're not free, where they can't make their own choices. There are people making choices for them instead of the drug or the alcohol making their choices. And so it is so hard to find a healthy place. And if you're in an unhealthy place, or you're in a small town where you want community, you want a church, it is really hard to resist the toxicity of all of that power and control, and an over amount of influence, and an overbearing amount of influence. Sometimes it's subtle pressure, sometimes it's social pressure like peer pressure, and sometimes it's just in your face, pointing their finger at you and intimidating you, because they really believe that they know the creator of the universe, who's got a rule book, and they're so powerful in gaining that influence over people, that when there's somebody who is sort of undecided about their life and about their faith, those are the ones who are vulnerable. And I see it so much, and those are the people that tend to get hurt. And disabled people, children, elderly, ex-convicts, substance abusers, ex-substance abusers, there's a lot of people who are vulnerable to that type of suggestion. And it's hard to find a congregation where they'll just accept you and, hey, whatever you believe, that's okay. Believe that, as long as it's not harmful. We will find out, exactly if it's harmful or not, without butting in too much, and without, trying to get you to say things that you're not comfortable saying to strangers. One of the things I do appreciate about the Christian circles that I was in is there was an intimacy between men. It was amazing how men could cry and they could hug each other. And these were like NRA guys, These were like, rural American ranchers and farmers and Republicans and folks. And it was amazing how some of these men could be vulnerable in a faith context, a faith that seemed to advocate for a lot of aggressive behavior. These men could be very soft. And it was okay in certain circumstances to do that, like in times of worship, and they're raising their hands and they're crying, like at Promise Keepers and stuff like that. I find that interesting, and I find that admirable as well. unless of course they're taking advantage of men who are being vulnerable, and who, and again, it's the same kind of conundrum as well, is that there's a good point to that, and there could be a negative point to that as well. So if I were to choose a religion or a deity, I would choose somebody who doesn't really even have a voice, because there's a lot of voices out there that are either entities from other worlds, if you want to believe that, or maybe they're just some kind of psychology, or maybe it's just some kind of programming that had to do with a certain ideology that's just like old tapes repeating in your head, that, you're nothing in yourself, you're everything with this name, you just call upon this name, and you're everything, and you're loved and accepted, but, once you disobey that thing, or once you fail that thing, then you're nothing. And that's a tough thing to do too, because it boosts your self-esteem to think, like all these scriptures, there's like dozens and dozens of things in the New Testament that say in Christ, that, we are this, we are that, and we can speak that over ourselves and feel real positive. And at the same time, there's something in your head saying, yeah, but what about me though? Am I just nothing in myself? And I think that could be hard on my self-esteem. Although it feels good though to identify with something bigger and take that bigger thing into you, just as long as you know exactly where that invisible voice is coming from, what its motive is, and what its eventual fruit is in your life. And I attribute that to getting some emails saying that there's an African prince that just wants my account number and is going to give me a bunch of money. And so I don't know this person. It's just words. And those words seem powerful to me, and they seem to want to give me a whole bunch of things as long as I surrender something very personal. And I see faith a lot of times as getting some random emails, somebody coming up to you and saying, hey, this is real. I'm an ambassador for the creator of the universe, and this is the way things are, and I'm sorry, but you have no choice. There's a judgmental God, and he demands that you do this and do that, but he's good, and he loves you, and all you got to do is give him everything, and he'll give you everything for free. It's a free gift, and it's like, whoa. If you think about it, that really makes no sense. If a person were to offer you that much and say it's free and then demand so much at the same time, so that would be a hard thing to choose a faith like that. And it's no wonder that I did, because I was so vulnerable. It was so powerful, and it offered so much. It offered a lot of explanations, and it offered me basically everything I wanted and needed at that time. I really couldn't say no, and I'm glad I did. I have no regrets for 12 years in born-again circles. And if I had to choose again, I would say, if there is a God of love, if there is a creator of the universe, that I shouldn't be obligated to do anything. If it's free, it's free. And if I have a rule book, it should be a book of rules to protect myself and other people. It shouldn't be a way to separate myself from others. And if it is the only way, then how does that make me feel about others? Is that going to give me a superiority complex? If it's going to teach me humility around others, but also make me think that anybody who doesn't believe like I do is going to have this eternal punishment, and if they don't have something that I have, then how does that not give you a superiority complex? How can you walk around and looking at the world and thinking, I'm going to heaven, they're going to go to hell, they're going to go to hell, they're going to go to hell? How are you going to treat others if you believe in that? And what that does is that creates a complex in your head. And that's another tough thing to do. So it's really hard to be in a faith community and not allow that toxicity. And I think there are ways that people can resist anything that is harmful in a belief system and a religious practice and a community. And I think that if we were to choose, if we did have the freedom of choice, I would try to find something that would focus more on serving people. So here's the thing about church and about religion, is that when church begins to get toxic, and a lot of people don't like to use the word church because it represents a lot of things that have hurt people in the past. And we don't like to use the word religion because it connotates rules and regulations and government and bureaucracy and all that kind of stuff. Or just a heartless behavior of somebody who might not necessarily believe, but they do this stuff just because that's their religion and they do it out of fear. People don't like the word religion either. So they try to change their language. And unfortunately, what I've seen is that they really just change the way they talk about themselves. And so there'll be a place that'll be called Grace Church. They'll change it to Grace Christian Center like in the 80s. And then they'll change it to Grace Fellowship. And then they'll just change it to Grace Community. And then, well, we're not a church, we're a community. We're a community of spiritual people, not religious people. And then you just kind of think about, well, what's the word church? A church is somewhere where you have faith-based music, you have an opportunity to give an offering, whether it's a little box at the door or whether they have an offertory. They have announcements with stuff to get together with, and they'll have a message. And if they have most of those elements or all of them, you're in a church. If those things define obviously what a church is and they're doing that, you're in a church. And if they call themselves not a church, then what happens, you're in an environment that's basically saying, this is the label on the can, but we're switching the label because we're believing it's something that it's not. The same thing with religion, is that religion is something where there's a common belief system and they have a common practice together, and they have stuff that basically has some kind of belief in a deity and surrendering and humility and learning about stuff like that, and having an ancient text or maybe even a modern text that they use or something like that. And then there's, some people believe, including myself, that like institutions like the Grateful Dead and even the Communist Party can also be seen as a religion because of the way people treat it. But what happens is when people start identifying as, well, I'm spiritual and not religious, what they're saying is that they're painting a picture of this is what we say we are. And then what they're doing is something quite different. And I think that can be some cognitive dissonance, especially for people that are, lower functioning mentally and emotionally. That can be really hard to be around that. And it could compartmentalize your thinking if you're around that community and you start telling people the same spiel. Well, what kind of church you go to? And you say, oh, we're not a church. We're a non-denominational blah, 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 blah thing. And then that starts getting creepy because that's how a lot of cult members do when they talk about their organization. And then you ask them another question about it and they give you the same spiel. There was a group called the Hashers, and they were this nudist, free love, drinking, jogging, fucking each other kind of a thing. And then they had this spiel that they would tell people, and no matter what question I asked them, they would tell me the same thing. It was so creepy. So it's kind of funny that even a group who is so like violently non-faith, like we're this excess of irresponsible behavior. And I'm sorry if anybody is a hasher or has a respect for them. This has been my experience of those people. That even being non-religious can be a religion. And it could be another toxic community, especially if they keep telling people who they are, whether it is or not. But if that becomes an autonomic response, then that gets kind of creepy to identify with a group that keeps having to explain themselves to people in the same way. So if I were to choose a spiritual community, it would definitely be one, like the meditation center. I felt like that was very healthy from a mental health perspective. Now, the culture I didn't like. I do like the culture of Bible people because I do like their strength, their boldness, their hardworking attitude. I do like their honor and respect and that kind of stuff. And I would just love to have a community that could that could suit my needs, which would be a conservative culture and liberal views, which doesn't happen. And so that's why I call myself devout unaffiliated. And it's really hard to find. And there are some people that are blessed to be able to get along with others really well, and they might have a common belief in a large group that they could identify with, and I admire that. Just as long as you take a step back and you just examine what people do and what people say, what they believe and how they talk, and find out if you keep doing that, if you keep believing that, if you keep saying that, is that healthy to yourself, your relationships, your self-care, and your mental health, and your personal growth? And then you just simply evaluate that. The problem is, a lot of times we don't think we have a choice. A lot of times if something is overbearing or people believe something really strongly, we don't think we have a choice in that. And that's the one that you need to challenge the most. And that's the hardest, because there is such a fear of hell and there's such a need to belong. It's really hard to get over that stuff. But when things get really fucked up to the point when you have no choice but to challenge it, then unfortunately that's what people have to come to. But hopefully it doesn't get that bad and you don't reach that point to where you're wondering if you're going to take your life or not. That's definitely a harmful community if the influence of that community is leading you to self-harm and suicide and compartmentalized thinking and, you know, behavior. I met this guy last year who was drunk at a nude beach, and he went to a certain Pentecostal sect, and I knew quite a lot. In fact, I knew more about his particular denomination than he did, but it was so funny how he was defending it, and here he was living nothing like it, and that's so sad. That is a form of crazy, and that's so common, it's so cliche, and if that's where people are at, then that is the most important thing to do, is to challenge it. And for me, it wasn't that hard because I had to. Because if I didn't challenge my faith at that time, I would have ended up taking my own life. And reintroducing things slowly was also very healthy for me as well. And I just hope that, you know, when I talk to people, that their guard doesn't come up right away when they're afraid to challenge their belief system. Their whole world, their reality is painted this certain way, and when you try to challenge it, it all falls apart, because it's built on all these explanations and all these things that have tried to create this reality. And it's really hard to challenge that. But it's possible. People do it all the time. It's just, unfortunately, they throw the baby out with the bathwater, and in some ways that's what I did, because I realized that for me to create my Christianity in a way that wasn't harmful, I actually started attacking the very fundamentals of the faith, of the earth is cursed, that we're born in sin, that we have to have a savior, that we have to have somebody come into us and stuff like that. And what does that do to my self-esteem, and turning the other cheek all the time? And, you know, how does that handle with my codependency, asking, giving to those that ask, and then also, you know, the hearing voices thing, and the thing about, like, God works in mysterious ways, and this isn't logical, but, you know, faith conquers logic sort of a thing, and making a lot of bad decisions. Yeah, that was pretty harmful. And then I realized that that just sounds like all of Christianity. However, I think there are ways that people, especially that live with mental disabilities, could find a healthy way to practice their faith that's not harmful for themselves or their relationships. And I'd like to know. I really can't think of ways right now, because that's my perspective. However, I would think that there are ways that somebody could really serve people and live as a Christian in a way where they don't have to come up with all these explanations in order to create this reality. I think if they don't believe it, they can pick and choose the things that they want to believe or not, if they think they are free to. It's just that that's hard. That's hard for a lot of people. And what's hard about the Bible is that it is kind of a take it or leave it kind of a thing, because it in itself requires full obedience. And that's what's hard about it. And so there are a lot of liberal churches, I think, that would be healthy places for folks. It's just that that culture and that community is very toxic for a lot of people as well, especially with conservative backgrounds. So it is very difficult. But it's good to know, though, how challenging it is to actually create something that's healthy for your faith and your mental health and your relationships without throwing something away or without totally doubting it or challenging it or giving it up. It's very difficult, and it is possible, and it's a lifelong journey too, because who knows, in 5 or 10 years I might be some kind of faith preacher or something like that, or I might be a total atheist. I don't know. It's interesting that Stephen Hawking has this period of time where God is on the table, and then he has a theory that, well, there's no God in that theory, and then, well, God comes back in this theory. So I think that it's important to be open-minded that there is a God, as well as being open-minded that there's not. And I think that if we keep that and we make sure that it's healthy to believe both of those and to find a way to actually have them coexist, which would be really cool. And that's a big challenge, and that's something that I've tried to do in my life, is to live a life as if there is a God and if there's no God. And I think it's possible. It sounds crazy, and if it makes you crazy to live that way, then don't do that. It's just that there is a possibility where you could see things in both ideologies that are helpful and find out what things explain a healthy world that you want to live in, and then make sure that it doesn't harm yourself, your mental health, or your relationships. And keep challenging it and keep an open mind. And I might be wrong about all this, and I'm probably wrong about half of my ranting. And a lot of this has to do with my rapid speech, which makes it very difficult to watch, so I really appreciate that. And this has been a tough journey, and I'm just still at the beginning of it. But I think a lot of people can relate, especially those who've endured a lot of religious abuse, but there is a lot of healing for that. And I think that being involved in religion, being involved in a church can be healing as much as it can be harmful if you're able to basically not drink the Kool-Aid, for lack of a better term. And unfortunately, sometimes the best way to experience something is to go in head first and to do it and surrender completely. And that's a leap of faith, and that's what makes faith so amazing, and it also makes faith so dangerous and harmful at the same time. Because I can say I've drank the Kool-Aid and I survived. It's just that I was lucky. I was really lucky, and I'm still here to tell my story.